what's happening, herpers? We'll get started as soon as Spot, my Western Diamondback, quiets down. Any second now. Just tiring himself out, he's going. There we go. Hey, how's it going, herpers? I'm Herpin Hippie, and today I'm going to be going through and feeding the rattlesnake you just heard, along with my boa constrictor and tegu, and I'm going to be talking about some recent complaints I got on a video I posted. I recently posted this video.
Oh my gosh. What do I do?
And for anybody who misses it and is unaware, I post shorts on this channel every single day, sometimes twice a day. So if you want to see more reptile shorts, make sure to hit the subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss out on those. But anyway, that was a short I posted earlier this week, and I got a lot of complaints about what the heck am I doing feeding my snakes on bedding? Shouldn't I, as a lifelong reptile keeper and even a professional reptile keeper for many years, know better than to feed my snakes on bedding? Am I trying to kill them? Well, no, of course not. So I'm going to take on the internet experts in my comment section today and talk about why I usually do feed my snakes inside their enclosures and what the risks are associated with that, what you should be worried about when you're feeding a snake inside of its enclosure, and what you don't need to worry about. So if that sounds interesting to you, smash the like button and we will get into feeding the rattlesnake first. He's right over here. Alright, so we have Spot eagerly awaiting his rodents. There are the rodents that I will be feeding all of my pets today. That one in the top right corner is Spot's. And as you can see, I don't have them just soaking in water. I have them sitting on paper towels. And that is one of the first tips that I have for how to make sure that your snake doesn't ingest bedding, even if you are feeding them inside of their enclosure, like I'm going to do with this rattlesnake. And I will get this cage open and explain why right now. So this rattlesnake is a Western Diamondback rattlesnake. He is very feisty. He's not my friendliest animal, and more than anything else, he stresses out a lot when he's taken out of his enclosure. If you've seen some other videos on this channel, you've seen him get away from me, and you've had to see me fish him back out from under enclosures. So coming out is not really fun for him. Well, I won't lie, it's fun for me. I won't keep him waiting any longer, so here is his rat. But after going through being removed, being caught, being put into a bucket or other feeding container, there is a good chance Spot here, the rattlesnake, will be all stressed out and won't even want to eat. So I do prefer to feed this one inside of his enclosure, both for my safety and for just managing his stress levels. And here we might see one of the downsides of drying off the rodent. So I dried the rodent so it wouldn't stick to the bedding as much. If Spot drags this right through the sand, it's not going to pick up all that much bedding on it. And the problem with that, if you are using frozen thawed prey, is that the rodent, once it's dry, won't hold the heat very long. So you kind of have to dry them off and then go straight to feeding, especially if you're feeding, oh, there he goes. If you're feeding any sort of reptile that has heat sensitive pits, because they will notice, hey, what gives? This rodent got delivered cold, and sometimes they won't eat it, but he struck it, and that is normal for rattlesnakes to strike and release. So now I'm just working myself into a safe angle to use both hands to release that rat. And now we wait. Alright, hopefully I don't disturb him too much, but he's behind me here looking for that rat. Usually rattlesnakes will take a few minutes to make sure their venom has kicked in and finished the job before they try to eat anything. So while he's waiting on that, I'll talk about some of the rationale behind why I'm feeding him in the cage. I already talked about why it's safer for me and lower stress for him, but just because it's safer for me and lower stress for him doesn't necessarily negate all the concerns people have. People get concerned about impaction with being fed on sand or bedding. But the reason that I don't really... He's given his 2 cents now. Anyway, the reason I feed inside of enclosures is there are 2 main arguments against it. The first is you might make a food-aggressive snake, so that just is to say if you only ever interact with a snake when you're feeding it once a week and it's used to once a week the doors on the enclosure open up and then the first thing that goes inside the cage is a rat, well, you're kind of training that snake to bite everything that comes inside his cage, which is a problem if you want to hold your corn snake or ball python every now and then. This isn't an issue for me because I do not free handle venomous snakes. It is not worth the risk. It is not worth the negative news stories that break when people do get bitten free handling and doing stupid stuff. So I'm not concerned if he has an impulse to bite the first thing that goes inside of his enclosure. He's a rattlesnake. He should be able to bite things that get too close to him. That's in their nature. They don't like things getting too close to him. You keep hearing him rattle because I'm making too much of a commotion here, and we'll probably need to move before he finishes eating his meal. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. But while I'm feeding him, I will share a tip with you which will kind of help with the second big concern that people have, and that's the issue and risk of your snake eating bedding while you're feeding them. So while he rattles at me for being too close to him while he wants to eat, I will spin you guys around and we will check out my other rattlesnake. Alrighty, here's our next customer, Bojangles, the Western Diamondback rattlesnake. And now the second tip I have, besides drying the rodents off so things don't stick to them, is actually wetting the bedding before you go to feed your snake. Now, depending on your snake, misting them down might stress them out a little bit, and you might need to mist them in the morning and then come back and feed later in the day. But the more moist the bedding is, the less it will stick to whatever their prey item is. So I will pop open the second door here. Maybe. So I will go ahead and do that now. I'm just gonna kind of mist around him. I'm gonna try not to mist Bojangles the rattlesnake too directly all the time, keeping in mind that he is a venomous snake and I do not want to get within his strike range. Because I do feed my snakes in their enclosures, he might have a little bit of a feeding response, but I'm not concerned about it because I never need to worry about holding him. And if I am close enough for him to bite me, then that means I have already crucially messed up in some way. So now that he's moving, just gonna mist down a little bit of the area where he was staying, because dry mice and slightly damp bedding really don't stick together like a wet mouse and bone dry bedding do. All right, and I love when he's sitting over in that corner, so I will zoom in, staying nice and safe out of his strike range. I will offer him his lunch now. Here we go. Fun hearing him. He's doing just those slight rattles back and forth, like 1 a second, less than 1 a second, but you can still hear Spot rattling like crazy behind me. You can see he's a little defensive right now, probably because I misted him down. Usually I'll do this in the morning and feed him in the afternoon, kind of like I suggested, but I wanted to film what I meant by misting the enclosure. Oh, there he goes. Nice work. And as you can see, he is fully resting on the bedding now, but the mouse isn't picking up that much of it. I will get out of his space so he stops being nervous. He has picked it up now and none of that bedding stuck to it. So if you aren't worried about the potential of a feeding aggressive snake, you don't need to be worried about the other big argument that people are concerned about, the eating bedding and impaction issues, because there are easy ways to avoid it. But as he's considering his options and what he wants to do, I'll spin this back around and we will check in on how Spot's doing. Alright, when I started to say that, he was getting close, and then I moved the tripod and scared him and he moved away from it again. And from all the way across the room right now, I'm not going to get close and risk him stopping again. But just below him is our next customer, Elle, who has been scratching at her glass since I started defrosting these rodents. She knows what day it is. She wasn't hungry earlier this week because the weather is getting cooler and she's getting closer to brumation. But the smell of all those rodents in the air looks like it woke her up today, so I won't keep her waiting any longer. Oh, sweet, check this out. Spot is getting to work. Alright, so to avoid disturbing Spot, hopefully he doesn't spit out his food here, I'm just going to kind of duck below his sight. Yeah. You gonna come out? And as you can see, so I'm trying not to spook Spot here, but as you can see, I am going to feed Elle outside of her enclosure because she is not the slightest bit shy. She doesn't care if I hold her and then make her chase her food. She likes mice and she's going to do what it takes to get mice. So for me, this particular animal is easier to feed outside of her enclosure. She will eat less bedding if I feed her outside of her enclosure. So I usually do opt to feed this one out. And that's kind of the point of this video. There's no right or wrong answer here. You don't have to always feed your snakes outside of your enclosure. You're not irresponsible if you feed them inside their enclosure. There are just pros and cons to both and things to weigh. So for Elle here, I'm going to get her away from Spot so Spot can eat in peace. And we'll see how hard we can get her to work for her rodent. I'll set her down and we'll see what happens. And start recording. Hopefully that's picked up the mic I want to be recording on now. Elle just disappeared because I took too long. But that's alright because I've got her mouse ready to go. And I'm sure she'll come back as soon as she realizes what she is. Whoa! I looked at the camera and she almost got it before I wanted her to. Oh, good girl. Good job. Oh, I'm not allowed to see you eat. YouTube's not allowed to see you eat. Come back here. Oh, don't bring it over there. Lucy's gonna get jealous. I haven't fed her yet. But anyway, just to show you, I do take some of my reptiles out for feeding. Elle is one of them. But there Elle is. It looks like she enjoyed her meal. And besides me taking her out of her enclosure for feeding being a way to avoid her eating bedding, it is also just a great time to bond with her. You just saw that I let her out. She walked around the whole room, decided to come back to me on her own, which is a great feeling as a reptile owner. And feeding them outside of their enclosure and feeding them when they come back to you is a great way to reinforce that behavior when it happens. But I am gonna go ahead and pick her up. We'll bring her back to her enclosure. And I'm sure she will spend the rest of her daylight hours sitting up in that basking spot so it'll warm her up and she can fully digest those rodents. That is one of the risks around this time of year. Don't force your reptiles to eat. If they don't seem hungry, there's a good chance that they're not hungry, because this time of year, if it gets too cold for them, they actually can't digest their food and they will be forced to regurgitate it, or it will just sit rotting in their stomach. So it makes me happy to see her up there bask. She knows she needs that heat, and she was actually warm to the touch even after walking around my room. So I know she is still getting basking time each and every day, so I know she'll be able to fully digest this meal. Speaking of fully finishing a meal anyway, here is Spot, and as you can see, he has completely finished his meal. Alrighty, and speaking of finishing a meal, I just looked over here, and during the time it took Elle to hunt and catch and finish her meal, looks like Bojangles did the same and finished his meal. You can actually see the comparatively large lump in his stomach. He's still a pretty small snake, so it's real apparent where the meal is. And this is another reason I just enjoy feeding my snakes in their enclosures. Now, I don't need to pick him back up with that big lump in his belly. But that's actually one of the other risks you run by feeding your reptiles in a separate enclosure. If you feed them in a separate enclosure, they just finished this huge meal, it might have a big lump in their stomach. And now you have to figure out how you're going to get that snake back into its enclosure without stressing them out. With feeding the snakes inside of their enclosures, I can just turn off the lights in the room and leave when I'm done, and they get to relax for the next day, 2 days before being handled, and there's zero chance of regurgitation. If Bojangles over here had eaten inside of a feeding enclosure, and then I went and picked him up with tongs or even a hook, there's a chance that that interaction could stress him out enough that he spits up and regurgitates the meal, which is really stressful for rattlesnakes. It's a lot of work for them to bring the food back up. They can lose moisture when they bring the food back up, and it's just a worse situation in general than eating a little bit of bedding. Okay, and the next customer is Lucy, the Honduran milk snake. I'll get this opened up. And it looks like there's a little poop in here. I will probably wait until she is eating to clean that, just so I don't risk stressing her out. But I am going to go ahead and pull this Halloween decoration out of here. If you want to see how that got introduced to the tank and what Lucy's response to it was, I do have a short on my channel where you can see how she responded to that gift. And now she's either going to be inside that rock hut or under this tortoise shell. Fake tortoise shell, of course. But since she doesn't seem to be out and about, I'm going to try to do a little spot cleaning before. Get that poop out of there so there's no risk of her accidentally eating it. And I don't think it stressed her out for me to grab it right now because she wasn't around to see it. Don't tell her. Shh. All right. Oops. Almost forgot my own tip. So I'm getting ready to feed Lucy here, but before I feed her, I'm just going to do a little bit of misting down the bedding. This will help make sure that not as much of that bedding sticks to the rodent, if any. And the rodents are very dry by this time, and luckily I don't need to worry anymore about it being warm enough, because unlike my rattlesnakes, Lucy here doesn't have any heat sensing pits, so she's not going to care if it's a little bit cooler. Now it is fully defrosted. I'm not saying go feed frozen rodents to your reptiles, but it not being piping hot isn't going to be as big of a deal breaker as it potentially could for something like a rattlesnake or ball python, or something that has a way of sensing the heat coming off of their prey. All right, you might see her starting to stick her head out. She is right in that back corner, coming out from behind the rock instead of actually inside of it. I'll try to get her to come over here where I might even be able to get her to eat on her rock. That is another tip. If you have flat surfaces, rock surfaces, tiles even work well, like regular housing tiles being put inside of a basking spot. Those surfaces are of course easy enough to clean before snake feeding and serve as an area where they can drag the rodent around and not worry about it. Oh, you're gonna be faster. Wow, am I just holding it that high out of your reach? Usually she is on her rodents like nothing else. Oh, come on, get it. Come on. Ah, there you go. And now let's see how moistening that bedding actually worked, if it worked, because she is more than any of my other snakes. Just dragging that rodent around through the bedding. She was not interested in eating it on the tortoise shell. But we'll see what happens here. And while she's constricting that, this is a great time for me to bring up, if you didn't see last week's video about the python that was recently found to have eaten somebody, check it out. Warning, it's a very shocking video. It doesn't exactly have a happy ending, but it is very fascinating to look at the reasons why giant python attacks seem to be becoming a more common occurrence. So if you've enjoyed this video, or if you're just somebody who is still convinced that it is the worst thing you can do to feed a snake inside of its enclosure, then why don't you just check out last week's video and see exactly what snakes are capable of digesting when they really have to. All right, she has released it. I don't know if that is to reorient herself or if she has just noticed I haven't closed the doors yet, so maybe she's wondering if she's getting more. All right, look up, good. Want to make sure I didn't pinch her tongue in there. I'll close these just to give her a little bit more privacy and quash any hope of getting seconds before she's finished her first. Oh, I promise I'm not trying to tease her. I am the person who would die in the horror movie because I dropped the keys right before making it into the house while running away from the axe murderer. I am awful at getting keys to work. All right, it's behind you. So I will leave her alone while she figures out where she left that darn rodent. And now we will feed my last snake of the day right over here. My biggest snake, Cleo. Alright, so now I'm going to feed Cleo, the last of my snakes and the biggest of my snakes, and I'm going to give you guys one last tip for if you still aren't comfortable feeding your snakes inside of their enclosure and you do feel the need to bring them out. That can just be really hard with some big snakes like Cleo here, but if you're like me and live in a small house and are really limited on space, you might not have the space to dedicate to a big storage tub that is empty 95% of the time except for feeding day when it's just dedicated to feeding your snake, when you already have a big area in your house, hopefully, dedicated to housing them under normal circumstances. So if you don't have room for a big separate feeding tub, this is my workaround for that. Just lay out a towel outside of the enclosure. Usually big snakes are very eager to eat and they will come out a little bit to eat, and you can just have them eat with their head out, resting on whatever surface you are feeding them on, whether it's a towel, whether it's a plastic sheet of something, whatever the case may be. Usually big snakes are happy to do that, and it doesn't stress them out like trying to drag them all the way out of their home. I'll open that up and get the camera on Cleo here because I know she's way more interesting to look at than me. Oh look, speaking of interesting things to look at, Elle is paying close attention right now, wondering if she's gonna get seconds. But there is Cleo right there. And I will see how far out of her enclosure I can get her to come. Now, if I wasn't doing the towel thing, I would probably just mist down the enclosure like I did with Bojangles and Lucy to minimize the amount of bedding that she consumes. But I'm gonna go ahead and try to get her to eat this outside of her enclosure today. So here comes the train, the rat. You can see she is starting to coil herself up, getting those S curves in her neck. That is going to just turn into explosive striking energy any second now. I'm gonna see if I can get her to come further out for this meal though, because I want her to eat on this towel. Come on. Come on. there we go. And as you can see, she got a little impatient and dragged it into the enclosure with her. So now I will go ahead and just kind of mist down the bedding around her while she holds onto this and constricts the last remaining life out of her frozen thawed prey. Don't tell her. All right, and that misting is causing her to constrict the prey even tighter. So I'm gonna go ahead and close this up. Hopefully I dried off the rodent enough and misted down the bedding enough that not much bedding will stick to it. But even if it does, I have one last thing to add on to why I'm not concerned about feeding some of my pets inside of their enclosures. I figured I would use this time to talk about the other big issue that people have with feeding. If they're not worried about their snakes becoming food aggressive, then they're worried about the ingesting bedding. And first things first, the food aggression thing I mentioned with the rattlesnakes, I don't care if they're food aggressive, they're rattlesnakes. I'm never putting my hands close enough for them to bite me anyway. Ideally, that's the plan. But Lucy, the hunter, and milk snake you just saw eat, and Cleo, my boa constrictor, are non-venomous snakes. I do take them out. I do handle them frequently, and neither of them are particularly food aggressive. I think a big reason for that is I'll handle them anywhere from 3 to 4, sometimes 5 times a week, depending on what's going on and depending on how long I held them the day before or how much interaction they've had. But for an average, we'll go with I'll interact with my snakes maybe 4 days a week. 3 of those 4 days are going to be handling days and interaction days, and one of them is going to be a feeding day. Now, I don't ever really handle my snakes before feeding or after feeding on feeding day, just to help make sure that they don't ever associate me with food in that way. And then the other 3 times a week that their enclosure is opening, they're getting interacted with in some sort of way. So 75% of the time their enclosure door opens, they are not being fed. And I think that is enough to avoid a terribly food aggressive snake that just thinks it's feeding time every time the enclosure opens. Now, if you don't handle your snake, you never work with them, and you are just keeping them alive essentially by feeding them once a week, well, then you might have a little bit more of a food aggressive snake. You might have a little bit more reason to feed them in a separate enclosure. But even then, if you're not planning on becoming more involved with your reptile and handling them more often, is it worth it to elevate their stress right before they eat? I don't know. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I'm just giving you all my thoughts here so you can make an educated decision. But now the second and more serious concern people have, the idea that the ingested bedding is going to cause an impaction that can lead to more serious health concerns. I haven't seen it with my personal snakes, which isn't saying a lot. I don't have that many snakes personally, but I did used to work for a zoo that fed every single one of their animals inside of their enclosures, and I'm not saying you should ever base your care standards off of what some zoo is doing, but over years of feeding every single snake inside of their enclosure, I never came across one snake that had an impaction issue because of bedding they ingested. I came across snakes that were obese. We'd find a lot of obese snakes while doing necropsies. I found a lot of snakes that had various forms of respiratory infections, but I never found a snake just full of bedding. And if you think about it, it makes sense. They have incredibly strong stomach acid, so they are able to digest most things. The one bedding I have seen a lot of issues with is sand, but even then, not with snakes. Where I will say I did see a bigger issue is with lizards. I am of the opinion that bearded dragons should absolutely never be kept on sand, and that's because I've seen a lot of bearded dragons that during their necropsy, which is basically an autopsy for animals to figure out what happened to them, it was heavy impaction with sand inside of their intestines. I've seen it with chuckwallas too. For whatever reason, I haven't seen it with snakes, so if you're feeding snakes, maybe don't worry about it as much. If you're feeding lizards, I would just say don't house them on sand in general, and if you are housing your lizard on sand, then absolutely don't feed them in the enclosure. But as for feeding snakes inside their enclosures, I don't think it's the biggest problem in the world. Let me know down in the comments what you think, if you think it is a big problem and I'm a fool for doing it. Cleo just released her rat. She's still constricting it, but she let go of it with her mouth. Sorry. Get distracted. Anyway, let me know what you thought of today's video. Let me know if you have any other questions that I didn't hit in this one, or if you have any thoughts or concerns I didn't think of. I will try to respond to every single comment I get. And with that, I would just like to thank you for making it to the end of the video, as well as thank all of my patrons who make these videos possible, starting with my head herpers, Lindsay Justice, Lavenders, Deborah Torgerson, Bobby Cromer, Amanda Lynn, Tiffany H., and my newest head herper, Allie Ward. I would also like to thank the rest of my patrons who are scrolling down your screen right now. If you'd like to join this list of amazing people that help make this channel possible and help me keep making these videos, then you can sign up at the link in the description over on Patreon to support me for as little as $3 a month. That will get your name into the end credits of every full video, and my undying gratitude, because there is no way I could keep this channel going without your direct help. So thank you so much to all of my patrons. Thank you for watching the whole video. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week. I hope nobody out there manages to eat a whole bag of bedding, but most of all, I hope that you just keep herping.